Welcome to Circle Around. On this podcast, we hope to see, analyze, reflect, and respond better to our context by asking meaningful questions that lead to better questions. Our conversation is aimed at helping believers make sense of their world and then reimagine a new way of responding faithfully with full presence to the challenges of our urban society. We are your hosts, Lusanda and Mahlatse Mashua. What we love to do on this podcast is to discuss some of the challenging issues that are happening in our society and also try to see how we can ask incredible questions that help us to be better at responding to our world. And for me, the most beautiful thing is always looking at the incarnation. And the reason why the incarnation keeps being such a powerful picture for me is because we know that God doesn't leave us on our own in the things that the world is experiencing, in our own personal challenges. But God did not just sit afar and distance himself, but he came in the form of his son, Jesus Christ. The story where he goes to Samaria, right, in John chapter 4, speaks volumes to me because the writer makes a point of saying that he went through Samaria, meaning that there are those pre-existing racial and ethnic tensions that could have made him go around it to avoid it. He just decided to just go in there anyway and be present. And the reason I love the story of the Samaritan woman is because it shows us right there that this is what the incarnation is about. It's about God sending his own son to come and enter into the mess of our world and not avoid the mess of our world, but to experience it with us, and us in turn being invited to meet God, right? And that's why the incarnation is such an important thing to us. That's where we see the goodness of God break through right in the middle of all of our human brokenness. And so, Mahlatse, I'd love to know from you, where have you seen the brokenness of the pain of a broken world, rather?
Yeah, so this week I've been tracing certain conversations that I'm interested in and watching them on social media and really being bothered about how we are discussing just about anything.
Yeah.
I think before there was this wisdom that said avoid politics and certain topics because, they quickly degenerate into, toxic levels. But it seems like just about anything these days as a conversation leads a lot of us to talk past each other rather than to really have good conversations where we try to understand one another. So being on the different social media platforms and tracing those conversations and seeing that whether it's about music or politics or a judicial process or, the murder of someone, that the way these conversations happen, we're not setting ourselves up to really find one another, even when we have common cause, and that really grieved me in this past week.
And I can imagine that also people will probably behave on social media in a way that they probably wouldn't in real person, isn't it? Yeah, and where have you seen the goodness of God break through, or just see that brokenness being restored?
So this, but it's really spoken volumes to me in this past week as well, where Amani has this thing where almost every single night she comes into our room and she comes on my side of the bed and she wakes me up, taps me on the shoulder, or just taps me and just says, "Papa, I love you," gives me a kiss, and then goes back to sleep.
Yeah.
Right? Every single night.
Every single night.
Right? and I mean, it's I love it. I mean, on its own terms. I love that we have our thing with her and it speaks about our relationship, and it's, but it also has been speaking into my heart, because in the same way that I've been tracing how our conversations, can be so ugly sometimes, it gives me this sense of there is another way, there is a better way to engage people. There's a better way to spend ourselves in conversation. And I mean, it's a little thing, and of course it's framed within our conversation. However, it gives me hope that if we frame ourselves differently, perhaps, and we're interested in really connecting with other people, there are ways in which we can have better conversations, to be honest.
And I think that's why I love the story about Amani, because that's a beautiful thing for me to witness, you know, where she expects that if she comes in the middle of the night to show you affection, she's not going to be rejected or to be, you know, told to go off or whatever. She expects that her love will be received, and also that's where you just get love just from Jay, you know. And I think that's the power of home and belonging and relationship, all telling you that you belong here, right? So with some of the snippets that we've been sharing from our previous episodes, we put one of them on I think a week or two ago, and we're talking about where people belong and if they could tell their story. Then Matepo shared quite an incredible comment about how relationships can form context. So I'm going to read it quickly. She says, I'm really enjoying it, thanks. I just have a quick question. Thinking of this from a slightly different perspective, I'm just wondering what you think about non-physical space. So instead of a physical spatial location, what about the existential state of belonging, for example, between people and location? As I was listening, I was thinking about how I'm more likely to be attached to a community instead of a house or a town. Is place exclusively a location, or can we discuss it as a feeling or a state of belonging? And I really like that, because I realize actually it's relationships that also give us a sense of belonging, isn't it? And I think that's what she's trying to touch on, that we can't always be tethered to places to say this is my permanent homestead and this is where I belong. But as we are moving around and places change, what are the things that are constant? And it's most likely relationships.
So yeah, that's really important, that even though we stress that the physicality of space, where people actually are found, is important. Where they actually live is important in the whole conversation. And remember that we're speaking about that those spaces really encoding stories. And that's really important. However, that's not the only way to think about belonging and identity and so forth, and home. And that there are also more ways to frame space, actually, in the way we understand space. And all of these come together, of course, to speak. They're not exclusive of each other, but they actually come together as we speak about the individual and as we speak about communities. If the individual is a product of their own stories, and then the community is a group of individuals who share common stories, then we can think about space, and we can think about belonging and identity as being complex in that sense as well.
Absolutely, and that ties into a book that was written by our friend Kupana Mabasomatla. She wrote a book called Coconut, and for us growing up, the concept of a coconut referring to a person was talking about a person who's black or a person of color on the outside, but they're white on the inside. And it was normally given to people that would, or young children. Let's say I was from a township, and then I was educated in a town close to the township where we lived in King Williamstown, and I went to a school that had been formerly all white, right? And I think all of the schools opened around the 90s, and so I went to one of those schools. And so to gain access to that school and to excel in that school, there are some things I had to assimilate to. I had to speak English. There was a way in which I could do my hair that was non-threatening. There was a way in which I had to talk and relate that would espouse all of the cultural value of belonging in that school. And so that work of assimilation was something that I had to do to not only show that I'm excelling in that space, but also that I belong in that space. And now I had to obviously, code switch when I went back into the township to make sure that I tucked that part of my identity away, because being like I was in my white school, it was also loaded in terms of how it was in the township. And so I knew that I had to tuck that away, right? It meant something to be back home, and now you're this now. you're a coconut. And I think that was also to say that you're a different person, right? And that code switching is an exercise many Black children and children of color have to do as we move between these two spaces. You're either not white enough, you're either not Black enough. And I think many South African children can relate to that.
I definitely can relate. I mean, I was sent to go and study, in Nelspruit.
Yeah.
Moving from, and I'll expose my age here now, from standard 3 to standard 5. And it was in Nelspruit, in particular, Valencia was this town, this neighborhood that was predominantly Indian.
Yeah. And
so, but it was an English medium school.
Yeah.
And I experienced exactly those things where you land and you have to switch, and now everything is in English, and so you have to learn everything in English. Where back in school, someone would translate. Even when we did Afrikaans and we learned English, we learned them Kasepedi, right, and translate them. But now it was different, and so you had to learn a new culture.
Yeah.
But as you became fluent in that culture, you realize that it will alienate you if you took it back
to where you're from.
Yeah, away from.
Yeah.
Right. So you try as best as you can to tuck it away, because then you won't belong.
Yeah.
Right. So on this side, you're working very hard to belong.
Yeah.
Learning a new way of being. But then at the same time, which means you have to tuck away your
township.
For me, from a rural area, you have to tuck that away when you're in this space, and vice versa. So you have to leave that at the entry point, and become something else in that space. Otherwise, you'll feel alienated, but people won't be able to relate to you.
Absolutely.
In that sense, yeah.
I remember how I was learning a year before I went to KHS. I went to do extra English lessons by Aunt Christina, and I was going to Enozizwe at that time, right? I was in standard 2 going to Enozizwe at that time. And then I remember Auntie Christina was very militant. She was an Indian auntie, and she was teaching us how to say bird properly.
Bird, bad.
Bird, bad.
I don't even know if I can still say them. I know.
Third, right? And I remember how I literally, because I was still going to Enozizwe, right? I remember feeling like, listen, you are not going to get to Enozizwe and be like, that's a bird.
Yeah.
I literally would pretend to not know how to enunciate the words, because I also didn't want to make myself seem better than the other kids. And there was already something about the proximity to this culture that is like to a white culture that already assumed betterness, right?
Yeah.
That you're being sophisticated, you're being cultured when you
civilized.
Speak, you're being civilized when you speak a certain way, so much so that I had to tuck it away by having to change my accent to sound more African when I spoke in Enozizwe, because I didn't want to alienate my schoolmates, right? And what we basically just reflecting on is actually reminding me that places really are not innocuous, that they do something to us as well.
Absolutely.
Right? We enter them, we experience them, but that is not just a neutral thing, that those places actually do something to us.
So that's also how I got 2 names.
Yeah.
Where in my new school, my new English school, my teachers looked at my name when I introduced myself, Mahlatse, but that was too difficult to pronounce. Remember that also in that environment, we were told not to speak our languages, but the way that our languages were framed, other than English, was gibberish. We don't allow that nonsense here, right? We only speak English, and so even articulating your name, right, that was not an English name, was already going to be a problem. Let alone the fact that when somebody couldn't pronounce it as a teacher, they'd say, "Well, your name is too difficult to pronounce." And either they would give you a new name, or they would just look, and many of us, like myself, that was my middle name. Winston is my middle name. And you'll be known as Winston now. But then I became known as Winston at school. But whenever I went home, I was Mahlatse. So I had these 2 names that represented the cultures I guess, that I was immersed in.
Yeah.
And right up to my adult life, that's how powerful the concept of what space can do to you and what it actually can speak into in terms of your lived reality. It was only very late in my adult life where I then began to have the courage to introduce myself again by my preferred name, Mahlatse.
Yeah. And I mean, when I think about how a lot of these things, they happen in a way that won't immediately feel antagonistic. Some of these things you see way later on that, wait a minute, there's something here that is a type of a violence, right? So if you have to shed certain aspects of yourself to become more acceptable, not only would you expect that of other people eventually, because it becomes a norm, right? That self-erasure, in order to be palatable and to fit in and to be acceptable because of what this space requires, becomes a new norm that we create for other people. I mean, do you remember any time where you felt this has to end? This is who I am, and just any like initial jolt of responding against that type of cultural self-erasure in order to fit into what a space demands of you?
Well, I guess I can imagine that a lot of people have to adapt, even in a single day, to the demands of different spaces that they engage with during the day. So I think about, the conversation on GBV and what it means when we talk about women in the workplace, and how certain spaces there are set up to exclude other people or to advantage men, for instance, and how women have to perform exceptionally just to be average, or to be compared with the average performance of men in the same role, for instance. Or how you almost have to tuck away certain aspects of yourself, I've heard, in order for you to thrive or to be seen as somebody who's contributing, who's not a liability in a workplace. But I can imagine that many different people, as they go throughout their day, engaging with different spaces, engaging with different communities, that there are these expectations, that all of them speaking about the sense of, if you act this way, you belong. If you don't conform to these expectations, then you're out. You're an other in this particular place. And so, and for me, it came to a point, going back to my name, where I just got tired. And I got tired because, one, it's every time I say that name, this is my name, even though I'd said it so many years, and even though I justified by saying, well, it's my middle name, I could never get rid of the sense of dissatisfaction. But I didn't call my name that. And it even took someone to challenge me then, to say, but then why don't you do something about it? Because I felt disempowered to actually act to change it, but I was living with the sense of dissatisfaction. But there was a real moment in a place where somebody had come and asked me to introduce them to Mahlatse, because they'd heard that Winston also knows Mahlatse, could introduce them to that. And rather than taking the moment to introduce them to Mahlatse in that moment, I realized that it was a moment for me maybe to introduce myself, to Mahlatse as well. But I can still remember, where we were when that took place.
Yeah, and wow, that's really phenomenal, because I realize that in a country like ours, I mean, we have a very, very tragic past, right? And the reason why I think it's important to have these conversations is because when I think about the Hebrew faith, that Christianity is rooted in, I think about the importance of memory and remembering the things that have happened so that we don't go back, right? Often it feels like when you go back to these stories, I sense that there's a fear about going back that would cripple us, and perhaps make some of us, I know for myself, because I don't like confrontation naturally, I know that I try to avoid things that are going to cause me to think about hard things. But there's something though that I feel our faith gives us a very special capacity to do, which is to do the work of remembering what has happened so that we don't continue to perpetuate the things that would make God a willing participant in the erasure of people, especially in the name of our Christian selves, of our Christian practice, of our Christian faith, right? And so when I think about the work that we need to keep doing as people who follow Jesus, in going back to some of these stories and seeing the legacy that they come from and the legacy that they can continue to perpetuate, I feel that it's so important to keep having these conversations and constantly try to answer the question, how can we be neighbor better, right? And going back again to that story of Jesus walking through Samaria and meeting that woman at the well, right? Here's a woman who could have actually gone to get water with the other women at that time, but she didn't, right? She didn't because there was obviously some kind of disrepute to her that would cause her to not be allowed to go to take water with the women at that time. And I wonder if something about her experience took her voice from her and took her believability, took her agency and all of that, with a, like a reputation or whatever. And I think the way that story has always been taught, the way that I was taught that story, there was always a loaded reputation around that Samaritan woman, but Jesus went to meet her there. Like I said, in her place of not belonging, in a place of not being enough and good enough to go there with them. But she goes there alone, and he meets her there as a rabbi, as a Jewish male rabbi, and that was not supposed to happen. And there's something so liberating for me when I think of how part of experiencing freedom in Jesus also means that we can expect that every part of who we are really, really matters to him. So in how we ask the question, how can I become a better neighbor? I'm sure we actually need to get better at making room for those painful stories, and how we need to intentionally affirm things that bring out who God is and the beauty of God in other people, and also undermine and resist the things that erase the image of God on another. I don't know if there's some of those things that speak into this story of assimilation and self-erasure for you.
Simon the Pharisee has invited Jesus to his home. And usually that'd be a good thing, except that I think when we understand and we read the story, we see that he doesn't have good intentions for Jesus. We know this because when Jesus enters the door, he's not given the courtesies that usually would be afforded to somebody who's an honored guest. All right, the oil, the kissing of the hand or the cheek, the water for the feet, and also a towel as well. This is something that you would do very standard when you've invited someone to your home. But Simon fails to extend those courtesies to Jesus. The point is to humiliate him. The point is to embarrass him in public and to put him in his place. Jesus, you're famous out there amongst the normal people as a teacher of the law. But in here, we're going to put you in a place. Amongst those who are really experts, we're going to put you in your place. And so, but Jesus, when he walks into the door and he experiences this, he reprocesses this from anger to grace, and he walks in. He reclines at the table. Now we're told about another person. Now in this whole crowd, there's another person that the focus of the story goes to, which is this woman. We're told that she is a sinner. We're told that her sins are known in the city. We are told that her sins are many. And a lot of commentaries immediately jump at this point to say that she was a prostitute or a sex worker. But actually that's not explicit in the text. And there are a number of scenarios that actually could be true about her profession. For instance, if she was a midwife and she had regular contact with Gentiles, for instance, that could also fit. But it just goes to say that sometimes we've got to interrogate the lenses through which we read people as well in different places. But this woman, seeing the humiliation that Jesus experiences, her heart is broken. She's there also with her own agenda, and she's there to actually give gratitude. Jesus then points the story back at her and then gives us a window into why she's in that place. But being the person that she is and having the reputation that she has, she is judged by a lot of people in that space. She's judged by Simon, the Pharisee, the host, and she then feels very free to use her tears to wash Jesus's feet. Remember, they're walking in the dusty streets. Maybe a little pieces of dung comes in the cracks of their feet. And so this was something that was very normal, but she uses her tears to wash Jesus's feet. And because she's got no towel, remember, that's not why she was there for. She uses her own hair, and then she uses this perfume, very expensive perfume, to anoint Jesus. And a lot of people seeing her do this, they're taken aback. They're judging her. She's not only is she not meant to really be there, she's acting in a way that for somebody who's not meant to be there, this is too much. This is extra. This is extra. Know your place. Like, just being here should be enough. But you're exerting yourself. You're showing up. You're doing more, and you're showing off. The host, right, making up for his failures in this particular context. But then Jesus does something in noticing Simon the Pharisee's judgment of this woman and the judgment of Jesus, right? In other words, because Simon fails to see this woman and her story and sees who sees her for who she is, he then fails to see Jesus. And I think it's a warning that sometimes our relationship with God, with Jesus, can be directly affected for the worse by our failure to see people. Jesus, seeing this in the story, turns to the woman, while looking at her, says to Simon, "Simon, do you see this woman? Simon, do you see this woman?" And then tells the story. Well, this woman was actually, we had an encounter outside of this meeting where she actually received her forgiveness. So she's not here to be forgiven. In fact, she is here to express her gratitude. She's here because of what God has done to really gush out her gratitude, the right response to grace. She's here to express herself, to be free. And your failure to see that has made you not only not see your failure in your duty towards me as a host, but also to see this woman that you haven't seen her in a sense. She has more than you because she knows that she's been forgiven, and you, on the other hand, sit there thinking you don't have much to be forgiven. That's why you lack your gratitude. But it is in this idea of seeing people where we get this ethical imperative that says, look, if we are going to be better neighbors, right? If we're going to qualify ourselves as neighbors, it's important that we see people. We interrogate our eyes that we see with, so that we are seeing better all the time. Because in there, we may even be able to shed the things that make us judge people, make us not see people's stories, the thing that makes us exclude people, the thing that makes us think or not see that what people are becoming or who people are as a direct expression of their encounter with God, of the image of God being expressed through them, then we'll fail to see that, and will actually become a hindrance to God's image expressed in our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when we think about how our experience of God is never going to be divorced from that's what you're saying, right? Our experience of God and our ability to be changed and challenged by God is not going to be divorced from how we treat and how we see other people. and that's how our humanity is actually locked up in other people.
Absolutely.
Right.
Jesus says, if you're about to sacrifice, to God, make a sacrifice to God, and then you remember that you and your brother, your sister, you've got something between you. Leave the sacrifice there, and then go and fix that. Find the person and go and fix that. Now, for me, initially reading that, I was like, but it almost seems like what you're saying is, fixing this is more important, right? The thing with my brother is more important than making a sacrifice to God. Surely make a sacrifice first and then go. But actually, I think that it shows this dualism that I'm maybe thinking this through, that I'm separating them.
Yeah.
And maybe for Jesus, as I keep on reading him, it's not separate. He's saying, actually, if you're here to sacrifice and you're looking to connect with God, and you realize that the disconnect here, that maybe when you go and fix the thing with your brother, there you'll find the connect with God also.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So those two are not necessarily separate things.
So I think a good question to leave, that we could leave this conversation, we could depart from this conversation with is, how do we become good at making sure that we make room for one another, especially with the stories that already exist that say, here you have to curate yourself, here you have to manage yourself, right? There's something about that woman where there was nothing was neat here, right? It was scandalous to get there and do this, before a rabbi, but he didn't curate it because he knows her story, right? And if anything, that abandonment would have made them feel uncomfortable. But it's exactly because of what you're saying, because they're seeing all of the deficiencies in themselves and whatever else, and maybe making it about themselves. But I constantly think that that should help us ask the question: how do we become better at seeing the things that make other people make themselves neat so they can fit into our stories? How do we become generous? How do the places that we occupy become spaces of hospitality where people can come as they are? Because Jesus came to the woman at the well just as she was. She didn't have to tuck away the parts of her story. In fact, he leads into those questions where she feels like she must fully just, or at least he sees into her life. And they had this back and forth exchange because he sees her as she is. And he also makes room for this woman to be who she fully is. And how do we become like Jesus like that, where people can fully be themselves? I think that's an incredible question for us to start this conversation with. And Mahlatse, I always love having these conversations with you. Say you love it too.
I love it too.
Great.
And yeah. And that's not coerced. That's from deep down in my heart. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sitting and coming full circle with us. Our conversation and growth as people of faith is ongoing, and so we'd love to keep journeying with you. Our circle around family, seeing how we can keep our cycle of faith, action, and reflection continuing. So follow our Instagram accounts and join us next week as we continue circling around